A new poll has been released, which shows that the majority of people think that the country is moving in the wrong direction. More than half of people think Britain is moving in the wrong direction, according to a new poll that shows a drop in favourability of Sir Keir Starmer and his cabinet. The poll by Ipsos, which was conducted between the 9th and 12th of August, shows that people still prefer Labour leaders to Conservative ones, but there has been an increase in criticism of the new government. 52% of adults polled said that they thought Britain was heading in the wrong direction, while 22% said things were heading in the right direction. Sir Keir remains the most popular politician asked about, with 38% of people thinking of him favourably compared to 38% unfavourably. This is, however, a drop compared to his ratings just after the election. His net favourability rating has now gone from +7 to 0. Now, of course, it's hardly been a quiet 6 or 7 weeks for Keir Starmer. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, the country was literally on fire and race riots took place. Helena, how much of this is legitimate in terms of criticism of Labour, and how much of this do you think is, out of their hands? I mean, the riots, I think it's a stretch to completely blame Labour, given this was a long time coming. So do you think the party is getting a lot of unfair flack, or do you think they truly handled the riots poorly?
I think there was certainly things that Labour could have improved upon their
Mm,
handling of the riots immediately. Taking a week to call a Cobra meeting, for example, mealy mouthed comments on the actual nature of the riots, the kind of the terror attacks that we saw over the course of that period. This wasn't a particularly strong response. I mean, Keir Starmer is certainly not an orator. Let's be real. And I mentioned this on stream to Kevin Logan when I was streaming with him at the time, and saying that what the country needs in moments of crisis is a unifying, charismatic figure to be able to bring the country together. And Keir Starmer is neither of those things. In fact, he's a complete non-entity. So he was never going to do well out of the situation being handled in the way that it was. But of course, the fertile ground for the scenes we saw, whilst being aped by Labour, wasn't created by Labour. It was created by the press. It was created by the think tanks. It was created by the Conservative Party, and they were left holding the bag. So I'm not going to lay the lion's share of the blame at their feet. But of course, there are plenty of other things that they have done to piss people off. Immediately coming into government and saying, well, there's no funding for things. We're going to have to let universities go bust. We're going to take away the winter fuel payment from pensioners. Really important voting demographic, especially the kind of demographic that's likely to, I know, answer polls from YouGov and places like that and want to make their opinion known. You know, Attacking this group of people in terms of policy, not a good look. It's not a good look in terms of how you approach governance. They're not coming out all guns blazing, talking about how they're going to fix things. In fact, they're spending the vast majority of their time in government saying that they have no ability to fix anything because the economy was ruined by the previous government. Now, whilst that may be true, the economy was ruined, that doesn't stop them doing things. It doesn't stop them taking a more populist message and saying, well, actually, the problem here is that there's loads of wealth in this country. It's all in the wrong place. We could tax the rich and that would fund the wonderful things that we want to do to improve the country. But they are following a strategy of promising little and then trying to deliver more than they have promised. But at a time where the country seems to be falling apart and people are desperate for actual kind of tangible change, the softly approach is going to wear thin on the public very quickly, especially with a gigantic majority and essentially carte blanche to do whatever they want with over 400 seats in the House of Commons. The more that their time in office stagnates, the more that it feels like that their governance is sclerotic, the more likely the public are to turn against them. They have a very, very limited period to make people's lives better. Let's hope they do.
I mean, I suppose the really important question is, where do we go from here? I mean, what does Labour have to do? One, try and distance themselves from the handling of the riots, and I guess, that's if you think they did a really bad job. And secondly, to try and make sure it doesn't happen again, and to convince people that the country is going in the right direction. I mean, what can they do? Let's say in the next 6 months.
It's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, they would have to announce a budget. For me personally, I think most people are still feeling the country is going in the wrong direction because of their own material conditions. That's going to take large scale investment in things like the NHS, people stuck on waiting lists. They're going to have to, again, try and find, Keir Starmer's going to have to find some charisma from somewhere and speak positively about the country. right? Rather than denigrating and saying everything is broken, we need to come down hard on these thugs. But they need to find a positive message out of this. And rather than saying, "Oh, isn't it great that the police sorted out the far right thuggery on our streets?" No,
Mm,
no, no. It was the solidarity from the community. These were heartwarming scenes of the community coming together to fight up against fascism in this country. And for this not to be acknowledged by the government and celebrated, celebrating, in fact, the really and truly, there is kind of half or so of Reform UK voters who had sympathy with the rioters. The rest of the country has no sympathy whatsoever and think that they disgrace Britain.
mm,
All the polling came out. Even conservative voters are broadly in line in terms of polling with regards to how they view the rioters as Labour and Liberal Democrat voters. They think the rioters shame Britain. They value that this country is seen as being more tolerant, right? Like, especially when a one nation conservative voters. There is a real market to bring people together by trying to find a positive out of what's gone on here in terms of the community response. And what has he done? Praised somebody, praised an institution, the police, who on a report card by an independent investigation were found to have got the lowest possible rating for investigating and solving crime.
mm.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
that doesn't sound like a functioning police force to me, especially when we have to do their jobs for them and stand on our streets to defend them against fascists.
I mean, I guess none of us were surprised that he came out in support of the police. The guy is a cop, right? But what do you make
Of
of
course.
his very authoritative response? I mean, on one side, it is quite cathartic to see the fash in jail. But at the same time, he's not just going after the race rioters. I mean, there are people of color, there are Muslims who are getting harsh jail sentences. I read one story that the judge said maybe you need to rise above the racism. I mean, someone going to prison for 18 months for throwing a beer can. He's doing an authoritarian clampdown on everyone, on both sides essentially, not those that are setting fires to hotels. I mean, he's doing that, but like to me, the context should be, well, the harsh punishment should be on those that instigate the race riots. And if you're protesting and you get into a bit of a kerfuffle, that should be at least understandable. But no, he seems like he's clamping down hard on everyone, which surely that's not going to work, is it?
I mean, unfortunately,
Mm,
whilst I agree with you, I think is that's not been done fairly to people who are responding to a race riot rather than people who are outwardly committing one. I think that these sentences have been unfair. But in terms of just the neutral political optics of this, in terms of what he can do to keep his approval rating high and keep Labour popular, unfortunately, this country is a very authoritarian country
mm.
in terms of
Yeah.
justice policy. In this country, people really do want to see harsh prison sentences for everybody. If they see people, regardless of whether the motivation is pure or impure, if they see them on the street committing a fray, which is what a lot of people have been sentenced for in terms of getting into bust ups with people from the other side of the altercations in this instance, they are not going to really take account of the fact that these were people defending their community rather than those instigating riots within said community. They see people committing a fray and they want to see them punished for the crime that they've committed, especially when they plead guilty to the crime that they've been caught on camera. I don't think there's any political capital for there to be leniency for those based upon the motivations that they had to being there in the first place. So for the optics side of it, I don't think he's got much to gain
Mm.
by being anything less than even-handed on this, especially since there's all this discussion about two-tier policing, which is obviously a
Yeah.
bunch of bollocks.
Yeah.
But
I
you see
do
what I mean
understand.
about how it's difficult optically.
Well, I mean, I guess the thing is that he could be. I mean, I think he could be lenient on those on the counter protest side. Again, like the people of color who are getting 18 months for throwing a beer can, standing up against the race rioters. I feel like if you're drowning the news with harsh punishment on the racists, then I'm sure he could probably get away with being lenient on the other side. Now, I get what you mean when people say two-tier policing, but it's kind of like the Republican attack line where they call Obama a communist. They're going to do it anyway, and they're already doing it anyway, even though two-tier policing, it's a myth in some way, but also actually it's kind of true in the reverse. Like when you look at Just Stop Oil protesters who are going to jail for 5 years for doing a Zoom call, right? And then you get in the 2011 riots, people going to jail for stealing basmati rice, and you're getting some thugs who aren't even getting that long in prison for doing much worse. There is a kind of two-tier police in the reverse, right? But they're going to say it anyway. So I completely understand that it's optically it's a very hard narrative to thread, but he could do everything completely right, and the right wing, the reform lot will attack him anyway. I kind of also want to ask you about communism. We've got literal British MPs saying that we're a communist country now because Keir Starmer is, being very tough on sentences. Are we a communist country?
I mean, what they're doing is confusing authoritarianism for communism. At the end of the day, if we look back, European history, some of the people who've been most persecuted by state action have been
Mm.
communists. I mean, NATO literally funded stay behind squads in Italy to go and hunt down communists. So we have been at the rough end of authoritarian policy in this country since 1945 onwards.
Mm.
Let's be real. Obviously, there was plenty of authoritarianism in certain communist regimes, right? I'm not saying that the NKV did nothing wrong, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, all of these attack lines aren't going to work because we're not a libertarian country. We are an
Mhm.
authoritarian in terms of how the population think. I disagree. I'm a libertarian in terms of my approach to justice policy. I favor rehabilitative justice rather than punitive justice. But I understand I'm in the minority. It's not politically efficacious to not seem to be taking a firm hand when it comes to this action for a politician in this country. And I've just, whilst I try and convince people of my libertarian arguments in this regard, I'm not fighting a losing battle running that on that politically in the current climate. I think Labour would be too.
I think it's hard to convince people, "Oh, you're living in the communist country because the government's really tough on criminals," and the response to British people was, "Yeah, good." Because you're right, that's the
Exactly.
mentality we have. We have far less of a sort of libertarian free speech movement over here than we do in the US, although the flag bearers of the free speech movement are capital L libertarians who aren't really free speech advocates. They just want to push their crazy ideas. But it's absolutely true that we do have an authoritarian mindset over here, and the whole communist thing isn't going to work.
It's not.
But I
Also,
I
one
find it
last point as
hilarious
well.
though.
Yeah. One last point as well is the with these free speech warriors, for example, has saying, "How dare the police arrest people for posting, incitement to terrorism
Mm,
on the internet?" Yeah, doesn't matter whether you write it in a letter or whether you say it in the street, whether you write it on the internet, it's still incitement to terrorism.
yeah.
Do you think all these free speech warriors getting mad at people being locked up for this would have the same reaction if they saw, like Salafi Wahhabists talking about how they needed to commit terror, like about inciting
Yeah.
terror attacks on their social media feeds? Of course they wouldn't. They'd be the first to call for these to be locked up or deported, sent back to a country they've never been to, whatever, because they were born in the UK. Like they are people who are totally hypocritical, who do not take an even-handed approach to these things. Like just as all free speech warriors do, they don't believe truly in free speech. They really believe in free speech for them.
Yeah, 100%. Whenever people say, "I love free speech," oftentimes it is just their speech and that's it. Because you're absolutely right. If it was a political enemy of theirs and they did something like this, they would absolutely not like it. And I also want to stress as well, I see it so much. People are blindly sharing stories on Twitter. One particular story comes to mind, which is a picture of a guy from Bristol, and he got 18 months, I think, for supposedly grinning at a police officer. And obviously, the right wing media and the right wing figures like Lawrence Fox are saying, "Well, this is authoritarian Britain." It takes 2 seconds to Google the story, and it turns out no, this person wasn't jailed for grinning. He was jailed for kicking and punching officers and police dogs. So literal violence. So that has to be put into context, which a lot of people they're not saying that.
Patreon.com, Turn Left Media. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you, Turn Left.